Hey everyone, if you love true crime but don't always have time for a full hour-long deep dive, I've got a podcast you'll want to check out. Morning Cup of Murder delivers daily true crime stories in quick, bite-sized episodes, perfect for your morning routine or whenever you need a true crime fix. With over 2,000 episodes and more than 40 million downloads, it's clear that listeners keep coming back for a reason. Korina, the host, has a way of making each case compelling, whether it's a well-known crime or one you've never heard of. I'll let you hear it for yourself. Here's a short clip from Morning Cup of Murder. If you like what you hear, just search for it wherever you get your podcasts.
There were two more murders 15 miles away in the Silver Lake section of Los Angeles.
We have a weird homicide.
Morning.
Cup of murder.
Sometimes it takes decades to finally learn the truth. On March 18th, 1985, a woman died and her cause of death was listed as a suicide. It would take almost 3 decades for police to finally prove what they suspected all along, that she was the victim of a homicide. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. In the year 1985, Meg and Scott Perk were happily living in an apartment in Akron, Ohio, preparing for the arrival of their very first son. Married for 3 years by this point, Meg wrote a letter to her grandmother in New York about the couple's impending arrival, talking about how excited she was and how the grandmother was going to be a great-grandmother any day now. Just 5 days after this letter, on March 18th, 1985, Scott Perk called the police and told them that he found his wife hanging from the second-floor railing of their apartment. He claimed he was in the bathtub at around 11 a.m. when he saw Meg walk past the doorway. Minutes later, he made this shocking discovery. He told police that he cut his 24-year-old wife's body down from where it hanged and tried like hell to administer CPR while waiting for the ambulance to arrive and hopefully save her. When they did, they found Meg Perk completely unresponsive and in full cardiac arrest. They managed to restore her pulse and rush her to the hospital, but both she and the baby she was carrying for 9 months passed away. Immediately after hearing the news of her death, Akron police felt something wasn't adding up with Scott's story. They suspected foul play from the very beginning, but could not find enough evidence to prove it. Things got even more complicated when, despite their suspicions, a physician named Dr. Roberto Ruiz came in and concluded that Meg Perk died of heart/lung failure from asphyxia and noted just mild abrasions at the front of her neck and under her chin. The doctor was never trained in forensic pathology, yet the former Summit County coroner, William Cox, signed his report based almost solely on the statements given by Scott Perk, the only other person in their apartment at the time of Meg's alleged suicide. Dr. Ruiz also noted that Meg, again based on what Scott said, struggled emotionally and had attempted suicide in the past. Meanwhile, Scott Perk took 2 polygraph tests, one of which was inconclusive, and the other he passed. Police said that there were some, quote, conflicts in the 22-year-old's story about the day that Meg died, namely his assertion that there was a suicide note that was now conveniently missing. There were also claims made by Scott that his wife was incredibly ill throughout her pregnancy. Yet when speaking with others, they said she wasn't sick for the first 7 to 8 months. No one could quite understand why the seemingly happy woman on the cusp of being a mother would end her life. Especially her own mother, Ann Metcalf, who never accepted suicide as her daughter's cause of death. She would call the police once a year to see if they would reopen Meg's case, but each time, they told her that they could not do so without new evidence. Meanwhile, within that first year as a widow, Scott Perk was convicted of a string of burglaries in the Akron area. Dubbed the Ninja Burglar because he carried nunchucks or throwing stars, He would target the homes belonging to single women and leave with a pair of their underwear as a trophy. He was charged with multiple counts of aggravated burglary as well as grand theft for a dozen or so crimes, and pleading no contest in May of 1986, he was sent to prison and paroled in 1993. He managed to stay completely off police radar for the next decade or so, until the home he shared with his second wife and 2 children suddenly caught fire. In March of 2009, Scott Perk, his wife Tammy, and their 2 teenage children woke at 3 a.m. to find their home engulfed in flames. They managed to flee without any injury, but when firefighters arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed a burn pattern consistent with arson. Also suspicious was the fact that, despite claiming they woke up to the fire already ablaze, they somehow managed to have their vehicle already filled with personal sentimental items, ones they would be devastated to lose in a fire, almost as if the car was loaded up with the items prior to the fire being set. At the scene that night just so happened to be then Sergeant Ken Mifflin, the lead investigator in Meg Perk's murder decades before. Here was a man who already suffered from a tragedy, one police long suspected he was involved in, who now sat there telling the sergeant all about what he did the day before the fire when he suddenly went off on a, quote, tangent and brought up Meg's death. Sergeant Mifflin was shocked and immediately suspicious. So Meg's case was relooked into alongside Scott's possible involvement in the arson. While that was happening behind the scenes, a second suspicious fire happened a block or so away from where the Perks were now living about a year after the one that claimed their home. A resident at the Burglar Avenue duplex was fast asleep when a neighbor alerted her to a fire in her unit. Gathering evidence for this particular incident, police found enough to tie the entire thing back to Scott and Tammy Perk, a couple they already believed set fire to their own home to collect insurance money, and who were now suspected of setting this second fire in an effort to make it look like a serial arsonist was active in their area. They were eventually indicted for attempted murder, aggravated arson, and insurance fraud. Meanwhile, the investigation into the death of Meg Perk hit a major upswing when just days after Scott was indicted for arson, his first wife's body was exhumed and retested by another doctor. This time, it was Dr. Dorothy E. Dean, a forensic pathologist. Noting the bruise pattern on her neck, she determined that Meg likely, quote, died from ligature strangulation rather than self-inflicted hanging, and voiced her suspicion that the ligature was likely a belt. In addition to finding bruise patterns that matched the stitching of a belt and the lack of V-shaped bruise indicative of hanging, Dr. Dean also found rope burns across Meg's chest, leading to the belief that she had been pulled into position by a rope, so her death could be staged as a suicide. There was also a bruise on her back that was never mentioned in the original autopsy report, that the doctor now claimed was from someone's knee pressing down with significant strength, possibly in an effort to hold Meg down while she was being strangled to death. As far as Dr. Dean was concerned, Meg Perk died of ligature strangulation, and her death was officially deemed a homicide. The same year her body was exhumed, Scott Perk pleaded guilty to the arson in January of 2013 and was sentenced to 28 years in prison, while the charges were reduced or dismissed for Tammy, and she got just 1 year probation. Then, in 2015, Scott was brought to trial a second time and charged with the murder of Meg Perk. Despite arguments from the defense saying the initial autopsy was correct in listing her cause of death as a suicide, the jury found him guilty of both murder and tampering with evidence, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. He remains behind bars. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear what terrible thing happened on March 19th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there's always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe.